Late-night television erupted in chaos as Stephen Colbert's interview with Representative Jasmine Crockett devolved into a verbal war zone, leaving audiences stunned when the Congresswoman exposed the host's private comments before storming off set. What began as pointed political banter quickly ignited into network television's most shocking confrontation in years. The studio lights at the Ed Sullivan Theater dimmed as Stephen Colbert strode onto the stage, greeted by the familiar roar of his audience. His monologue carried the usual sharp political commentary, landing punches against the day's headlines with practiced precision. But something felt different tonight. A subtle edge to his delivery, an extra bite to his words that regular viewers might notice. "Tonight we have Representative Jasmine Crockett joining us," Colbert announced, a hint of mischief playing across his face. "The firebrand Democrat from Texas who's been making waves in Washington. Although I'm told she prefers to call it speaking truth to power, which is what everyone in power calls what they're doing." The audience laughed, but there was a nervous quality to it. John Batiste, at his keyboard, shot a quick glance toward the wings. The band played Crockett onto the stage, all smiles and waves as she emerged in a striking cobalt blue suit. They exchanged pleasantries, comfortable small talk about the weather in New York compared to Texas, her flight in. The conversation had all the appearances of another standard late-night interview. Then came the pivot. "So, Representative Crockett," Colbert began, leaning forward slightly, "you've become known for your rather passionate defenses of progressive policies. Some might even say zealous. Let's talk about your recent speech advocating for what critics call open borders." Crockett's smile tightened. "Well, Stephen, I wouldn't characterize my immigration stance that way at all. What I've actually advocated for is a system where essentially anyone who shows up gets in," Colbert interjected, his tone light but the interruption deliberate. "I mean, that's the headline version, right?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual Colbert approach with Democratic guests. "That's a complete misrepresentation," Crockett replied, maintaining her composure. "If you'd actually read my policy proposals, I did, or rather, my team did. And they tell me it amounts to come one, come all. Which, don't get me wrong, sounds great on paper. Like communism or universal pizza Fridays." A smattering of uncertain laughter rippled through the audience. Crockett's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Stephen, I respect your show, but I'm not here to have my positions caricatured. My immigration reform package focuses on creating legal pathways to citizenship while maintaining secure borders. It's about humanity and practicality." "Humanity and practicality," Colbert repeated, mimicking her tone. "Two things that historically go so well together, like oil and water, or Congress and productivity." The tension in the room was palpable now. The camera cut to Batiste, who was studiously focused on his keyboard, clearly sensing the atmosphere had shifted. "Let's move on to your climate policies," Colbert continued, shuffling his note cards. "You've called for what amounts to shutting down the entire Texas oil industry within a decade. Bold move for a Texas representative. Do your constituents know about this plan to unemploy half the state?" Crockett set her mug down with controlled precision. "That's another gross mischaracterization. My climate plan calls for a gradual transition with job retraining programs and massive investment in renewable energy sectors, which would create more jobs than would be lost. The science is clear that we need to act. The science is clear." "Yes," Colbert interrupted again, his smile still in place but his eyes sharper now. "Just like the science is clear that if I drop this mug, gravity will make it fall. But the economic science of putting hundreds of thousands of people out of work overnight seems a bit sketchy." "That's not what I'm proposing, and you know it," Crockett said, her voice level but firm. The studio audience had gone quiet, sensing they were witnessing something unscripted, something raw forming between host and guest. "Do I know it? Because your exact words in the House chamber last month were that we need to rip off the fossil fuel Band-Aid rather than slowly peeling it away. Sounds pretty overnight to me. That was a metaphor about committing to decisive action rather than half measures, not a literal timeline proposal, Crockett replied, shifting slightly in her seat. If you'd like, I can explain the actual transition timeline outlined in the bill. Please do, Colbert said, leaning back with a theatrically patient expression. We've got all night. Well, minus commercial breaks and my other guests. As Crockett began to explain, Colbert interrupted yet again. Actually, speaking of your congressional contributions, let's talk about your voting record on military spending. You've opposed the last 3 defense appropriations bills while simultaneously criticizing our military readiness. How exactly does that work in your worldview? The representative's patience was visibly thinning. She took a deep breath before responding. My opposition was to bloated contracts and waste, not to maintaining our national security. Again, if you'd actually reviewed my voting statements, I'm just wondering how opposing funds for body armor squares with caring about troops. Seems inconsistent to me, Colbert pressed, his tone growing more pointed. The audience was dead, silent now. This wasn't the Colbert they knew, at least not with a progressive guest. That's a shameful oversimplification, Crockett responded, her voice gaining an edge. The amendments I proposed would have redirected funds from unnecessary weapons systems to better health care and housing for military families. Robbing Peter's tank to pay Paul's therapy bill. The first flash of genuine anger crossed Crockett's face. Do you actually want to have a serious discussion about policy? Or did you invite me here to misrepresent everything I stand for? Colbert's smile never wavered. Representative, this is a comedy show. We don't do serious here. We just point out the absurdities, like promising everyone everything while the national debt climbs faster than my cholesterol after visiting Texas. My district is in Texas, Crockett said coldly. Exactly. So you must know how ridiculous some of these proposals sound to regular Americans who don't live in the progressive echo chamber of Congress. The studio was tense now, camera operators exchanging glances, producers whispering urgently into headsets. This wasn't the plan. Something had gone sideways. Crockett leaned forward. You know what's interesting, Stephen? Before the show, when the cameras weren't rolling, you told me something very different about how you felt about these issues. Colbert's smile flickered just for a moment. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't you? Crockett challenged, her own smile appearing for the first time since the interview took its turn. Because backstage, you specifically told me you agreed with most of my positions, but were under network pressure to appear more balanced with the new executives. Should we talk about that instead? The audience gasped audibly. Batiste hit a discordant note on his keyboard. Colbert's face went blank for a split second before he recovered, laughing a little too loudly. Well, now that's certainly creative. I think someone misunderstood some green room banter. Did I? Crockett pressed, sensing the advantage had suddenly shifted. Because I believe your exact words were that the new ownership was breathing down your neck to tone down the progressive slant of the show. You specifically mentioned being told to be harder on Democratic guests. The camera caught Colbert tugging at his collar, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. The audience was completely still, witnessing something they'd never seen before. Stephen Colbert, master of composure, looking genuinely caught off guard. I think you're confusing me with someone else, Colbert recovered, his voice carrying a forced lightness. Maybe it was one of the producers who talked to you? Crockett's gaze never wavered. It was you, Stephen. In the green room 20 minutes before we went on air. Right after you complimented my earrings and before your makeup. Artist gave you that final touch-up. The specificity hung in the air. A few uncomfortable chuckles emerged from the audience, quickly dying away as they realized this wasn't a bit. Well, memories are funny things, Colbert said, his smile tightening as he pivoted. Speaking of funny things, your proposal for wealth, taxation, we're not done discussing what you said backstage, Crockett interrupted, something she clearly wasn't accustomed to doing but felt necessary now. You specifically told me you thought the network's rightward shift was, and I quote, making it harder to be honest about how extreme the other side has become. Colbert's eyes darted briefly toward the producer standing just off camera. The panic was momentary, but unmistakable. Representative Crockett, he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. This is hardly the forum for what? Honesty? Crockett pressed. Because you invited me on this show under false pretenses, proceeded to deliberately misrepresent my positions, and now you're pretending our backstage conversation never happened, the audience murmured. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something raw and uncomfortable. Colbert leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly, though the microphones caught every word. Look, we're on television. Let's keep this professional. Professional? Crockett's eyebrows raised. Was it professional to tell me off-air that you thought my climate policies were exactly what we need, but then mock them on air? Was it professional to claim I want open borders when you know that's not my position? Colbert's famous wit seemed to have abandoned him. He glanced at his notes as if they might contain some escape route, but found none. Let me ask you directly, Stephen, Crockett continued, seizing control of the interview completely. Do you actually disagree with my policies, or are you playing to network directives? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The audience collectively held their breath. This was uncharted territory for late-night television. I think, Colbert finally said, measuring each word, that policy discussions are nuanced, and sometimes comedy requires simplification that might— That's not an answer, Crockett cut in. This isn't about comedy. This is about integrity. Something shifted in Colbert's expression. A flash of the real person behind the television persona. For a moment it seemed he might break character entirely. What matters, he said carefully, is that we have these conversations, even difficult ones. What matters is truth, Crockett countered. And the truth is, you're sitting there attacking positions I don't hold, because someone told you to be harder on Democrats. The tension was electric. Batiste, perhaps sensing the need to diffuse the situation, played a few soft notes, but quickly stopped when both Colbert and Crockett shot him identical looks of irritation. Let's talk about your proposed education reforms, Colbert attempted, visibly trying to wrestle back control of his show. Let's talk about why you're avoiding my question, Crockett replied. Your viewers deserve to know if what they're watching is genuine or if it's being shaped by corporate interests. A smattering of applause broke out, not the usual enthusiastic approval that punctuated Colbert's shows, but something more tentative, conflicted. Colbert's expression hardened. With all due respect, Representative, you're here to discuss your policies, not to interrogate me about network dynamics you know nothing about. With all due respect, Stephen, she mimicked his tone perfectly, I came here to have an honest conversation, not to be a prop in whatever game you're playing to appease your bosses. The audience gasped. This was beyond uncomfortable now. It was confrontational in a way that late-night TV simply wasn't supposed to be. You know, Colbert said, his famous sarcasm returning like armor, I had you pegged as someone who could take a joke, but clearly I was mistaken. And I had you pegged as someone with principles, Crockett shot back. Clearly we were both wrong. The audience let out a collective, ooh. This had escalated beyond repair. Colbert's face flushed visibly under his makeup. I think we should move on. Your recent comments about judicial reform have raised eyebrows across the aisle. My comments? Crockett laughed, but there was no humor in it. What about yours? What about telling me backstage that you think the Supreme Court has been captured by extremists, but then criticizing my judicial reform proposals on air? I never said that, Colbert insisted, his voice taking on an edge rarely heard by his viewers. You absolutely did, Crockett responded without hesitation. Right after you mentioned that the network executives had a meeting with you last month about balance in coverage. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning cycling on. The camera operator panned to show the audience. Faces, frozen in uncomfortable fascination, witnessing something that felt almost too private for public consumption. Representative Crockett, Colbert said, his tone now glacial. We invited you here to discuss your work in Congress, not to fabricate conversations. Fabricate? Crockett's voice rose slightly, her composure beginning to crack. Do you really want to accuse me of lying on national television? Because I'm happy to get specific about exactly what you said, when you said it, and who else was in the room when you said it. Colbert's smile was now completely gone, replaced by something rarely seen by his audience. Genuine anger. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here? He asked, all pretense of the interview format abandoned. Crockett held his gaze unflinchingly. The same thing I try to accomplish every day in Congress, holding power accountable. The line landed, like a thunderclap. Someone in the audience actually applauded, then quickly stopped when no one joined in. For several excruciating seconds, silence dominated the studio. Colbert and Crockett locked eyes across the desk, neither willing to break first. The cameras captured every micro-expression, the slight twitch at the corner of Colbert's mouth, the steady resolve in Crockett's gaze. When Colbert finally spoke, his voice had lost its performative quality. Representative, I think you've misunderstood the nature of this show. We do comedy here. Is that what this is? Crockett challenged. Because mocking policies designed to help working people while secretly agreeing with them isn't comedy. It's hypocrisy. Colbert's nostrils flared slightly. You don't get to come on my show and lecture me about integrity. Apparently someone needs to, Crockett replied without missing a beat. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This had transcended beyond awkward television into something that felt genuinely consequential. You know what? Colbert said, abandoning his notes entirely. Let's be real for a moment. Yes, television is a business. Yes, there are pressures and considerations that the public doesn't see. But suggesting that I don't believe what I say on this show, I'm not suggesting it, Crockett interrupted. I'm stating it as fact based on your own words to me less than an hour ago. Colbert's jaw tightened. What exactly do you want from this conversation, Representative? Honesty, she replied simply. The same thing your viewers deserve. The word hung in the air between them. Something shifted in Colbert's expression, a micro-calculation visible only to those watching closely. His shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly as he made a decision. Fine, he said, his voice lower now. You want honesty? The truth is more complicated than either of us is making it out to be. Yes, there have been conversations about the show's, direction. Yes, I sometimes have to navigate between my personal views and what makes for good television. But that doesn't mean... It means exactly what I said, Crockett pressed. It means you're willing to misrepresent my positions even though you privately agree with them. All because some executive told you to appear more balanced. The control room was in visible chaos now. A producer had stepped partially onto the stage, frantically signaling for a commercial break, but both host and guest ignored him completely. Do your viewers know, Crockett continued, turning to face the audience directly, that before coming on air, Stephen told me he thought the network's new ownership was pushing for content that plays to both sides, even when one side is clearly wrong? Do they know he specifically mentioned being told to go easier on certain politicians and harder on others regardless of facts? The audience's stunned silence was answer enough. That's enough, Colbert said, his voice carrying an authority rarely heard on the show. You're taking private comments out of context and weaponizing them. Am I? Crockett challenged. Or am I simply holding you to the same standard you claim to hold others? You built your brand on calling out hypocrisy, Stephen. What happens when you become what you've mocked? The words landed like a physical blow. For perhaps the first time in his career, Stephen Colbert appeared genuinely speechless. The producer was now fully on stage, desperately mouthing "commercial" while making cutting motions across his throat. The band started playing, attempting to signal the break, but Crockett wasn't finished. "Your viewers deserve to know who's really pulling the strings on what they watch," she said, her voice rising slightly to be heard over the music. "They deserve to know that the authentic conversations they think they're seeing are actually being shaped by corporate interests and political calculations." Colbert finally found his voice. "That's an oversimplification of a complex—" "Is it?" Crockett cut him off. "Then tell them right now what you told me backstage about my climate policy. Tell them whether you actually believe it's dangerous, like you just claimed, or whether you think it's exactly what we need, like you said privately." The cameras caught the exact moment Colbert realized he had no good options. His hand reached for his earpiece, then dropped away. The producer was now frantically signaling to the control room. "We'll be right back after these messages," Colbert said mechanically, staring directly into the camera. "No," Crockett said firmly. "We won't." With deliberate movements, she unpinned her microphone and placed it on the desk between them. The sound technician scrambled, but her voice still carried through the studio. "I won't be part of this performance," she announced, standing up. "I came here for an honest conversation, not to be a prop in whatever game you're playing." The audience was completely silent now, witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television history. "The sad part," Crockett continued, addressing both Colbert and the audience, "is that you used to stand for something. You used to speak truth to power. Now you've become exactly what you once satirized. Another voice compromising principles for ratings." Colbert's face had gone completely still, his expression unreadable. "The American people deserve better," Crockett said, gathering her belongings. "They deserve honest conversations about issues that matter, not whatever this is." As she turned to leave, Colbert finally found his voice. "Representative? Save it," she cut him off without turning around. "I think you've said enough tonight. The question is whether you actually meant any of it." The cameras followed her as she walked off the stage, head held high. Several audience members actually stood as she passed, a spontaneous gesture of respect, or perhaps shock. Just before disappearing into the wings, Crockett turned back one last time. "By the way, Stephen, that joke about Texas cholesterol? My constituents deserve better than that too." And then she was gone, leaving behind a studio, thick with stunned silence. For several long seconds, Colbert simply sat there, staring at the empty chair across from him. The cameras captured his expression, shifting from shock to something more complex: anger, embarrassment, and perhaps a flicker of recognition. When he finally turned back to the camera, gone was the polished television host. In his place sat a man visibly shaken, searching for words that wouldn't come. "We'll—" he started, then stopped, cleared his throat. "We'll be right back." The band began playing louder now, trying to fill the void left by Crockett's departure. But the damage was done. Social media was already exploding with clips from the exchange, hashtags forming and trending before the show had even cut to commercial. As the cameras pulled back for a wide shot, they caught one last image: Stephen Colbert alone at his desk, running a hand through his hair, the carefully constructed facade of late-night comedy completely shattered. The director finally cut to commercial, but the moment had already been immortalized. A rare glimpse of authentic emotion in an industry built on careful curation, a confrontation that would be dissected and debated for weeks to come. In green rooms and production offices across late-night television, phones were already ringing. Network executives were being awakened with urgent messages. Somewhere, a publicist was having the worst night of their career. and in a car pulling away from the Ed Sullivan Theater, Representative Jasmine Crockett sat in silence, both dreading and anticipating the storm she had just unleashed. She had come to the show prepared for the usual political sparring. She left having exposed something far more significant: the increasingly blurred line between entertainment and truth in American media. By morning, the clip would have millions of views. By noon, it would be the only thing anyone in media was talking about. And by the time the next night's show rolled around, both The Late Show and American political discourse would be forever changed. The confrontation that began with a simple policy discussion had evolved into something far more profound. A moment of reckoning about authenticity in a world increasingly dominated by performance.